das Licht. Ja.
Well, a warm welcome to you, Mr. Tooth, Mrs. Utamö, Mr. Zorn, and Mrs. Rademacher, today's facilitator, distinguished guests here at the FAS Foundation. And I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to our audience here and in our live stream. I would like to welcome you to our event, Rising Prices, Exploding Costs, What to Do About High Inflation. My name is Mr. Gerber and I'm the head of Analysis, Planning and Consulting. So inflation is back. And it started last year in May, and we have an inflation of about 8–9%. And according to current forecast, we will reach a two-digit number. And after 50 years of quite stable prices and the oil shock that some of you might have seen, this is quite a shock because I won't tell you about the causes, but there are two main drivers. On the one hand, the COVID pandemic, which made supply chains more expensive, and the Russian war of aggression against the Ukraine, which led to a shock of energy prices, but it also affects commodities and food. And everyone is scared of losing out on prosperity, poverty, and the government does not know how to finance this in order to cushion the impacts of these multiple crises. So what can we do about it? This is today's topic, so I won't go into detail here, but there are a few things that I would like to mention. First of all, we need to fight the main reason. First of all, COVID. We need to get more resilient when it comes to added value and supply chains, and we need to do something about the energy price shock. It's easier said than done. We need to diversify our energy imports and to reduce our dependence on Russian oil and gas, but this is also about reducing energy consumption, increasing energy efficiency, and this is also about developing our renewable energies that we have turned a blind eye to in the past few years. So what kind of strategies do we need? We need a targeted and long-term strategy. And first and foremost, this needs to be fair in social terms. And we have now seen the third relief package, and those who have looked into it found out, and I will refer to the Institute of German Economics, there are two examples. The relief volume with an annual income of 35,000 euros is 950 euros per year, and if you earn 100,000 euros per year, it is 1,440 euros. Single-person households are even worse off. I'm talking about students, trainees, and pensioners. So if you have an annual income of 25,000 euros per year, you will have 318 euros. But if you earn 100,000 euros, it is about 1,000 euros. So there is an imbalance. This is one issue. And then there is the major question, how can we finance this? And Mr. Lindner said that this will be financed by the regular budget from 2021. And there will be the debt break from 2023 onwards. And furthermore, there's also hope that the windfall profits that were mentioned in the relief package will be very huge and help us to finance the relief package. And then there might also be the possibility that there will be a minimum corporate tax of 15% introduced by Germany, and Germany might want to go it alone. And it's very interesting to see how this is going to develop, because it will take some time. And that is why we have this new project of our foundation for a just future. We want to talk about the phenomena debt, inflation, investment, and we would like to take different measures, political education, in order to discuss this with people, because there are different crises like COVID and the war corroborating each other, and climate change. That's why government expenditure plays an important role, and we need to find out how to provide funds for that. And that is why we initiated this project. We ask ourselves what we can do about it. I will just mention a few examples in order to interest you in that project. First of all, we will go to pubs and try to convey political education. There's a very interesting financial pub quiz. Who knows that the tobacco tax amounts to 14.7 billion euros every year, and inheritance tax only accounts for 9 billion euros, and donation tax only 2.1 billion euros. The estimated volume of inheritance and donations per year is 400 billion euros per year. And who accounts for these 400 billion? Well, 65% with the top 10% and 30% with the top 1%. And the remaining 50% here in Germany, they will lose out because they don't have any assets or they have debts. And that is why we're going to create an inheritance tax, cooperating with the network Steuergerechtigkeit and the Association of German Trade Unions, and we will make suggestions for a new donation and inheritance tax, and we will underline how much the government is losing out on it. And then there is the idea that members of the Social Democrats don't know how to do their math, but I can promise you that we're well able to do math. There is the Bund der Deutschen Steuerzahler with the International Tax Day on the 13th of July. And this association says and they have certain claims that we will have to look into it. And then there is, well, another prejudice when it comes to members of Social Democrats, and they say that we don't have any humor, but we will do something about this as well. There is the T-Exit program, tax exit, which means the tax avoidance optimization carried out by people who are particularly well off. And we would like to know why they are doing this. Why are they trying to avoid tax and thus removing tax and income from the community? So we will do this by initiating self-help groups and try to create exit programs for these people. And I do hope that we will be successful. And then there is a particular play developed by the Munich Theater that is called Jeeps, very big cars, usually owned by people that own a lot of money. And what this play is actually doing is quite revolutionary. Let's say the state confiscates all kinds of inheritance and assets, and then the government will redistribute these funds among the population by a kind of lottery. And who is responsible for it? Well, the labor agency. And this will finally create a place where all those can meet that are not very well off, that are poor and deprived. And now I would like to ask Mrs. Rademacher to take the floor. She will be today's facilitator and will introduce our experts to us. She has been a freelance journalist since 2019, and she worked as the editor. She was an editor of Financial Times Germany for a number of years, and I hope that this will be a very fruitful event. Thank you very much, André Gerber, for these friendly words of welcome and the details that you have provided. A very warm welcome to this event, and also very warm welcome to all those who joined us online. We heard a bit about inflation already, so I won't comment on that. You don't need to leave your house in order to find out more about it. You just need to look at your utility bills and you will get an idea. And I will leave it to our first guest. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with him. He wrote a number of bestsellers, for example, Crash.
Wirtschaftshistoriker, Professor für Wirtschaftsgeschichte.
He is the director of the
Preises für Wirtschaftspublizistik.
He's the winner of the Hans Matthöfer Award for Economic Journalism 2019, and he's a professor of modern German history at Yale University. And he will give his speech in English. So if you need a German translation, please get a receiver. You will see here these two channels, channel 1 for German, channel 2 for English. But during the panel discussion, he will speak German, and then you will no longer need a translation. So, Mr. Tooze, the floor is yours.
Ja, guten Abend. Vielen Dank, dass Sie an diesem
Good evening. Thank you for coming here in spite of the terrible weather, and I hope that our discussion will be worth it. So I will switch into English, and then we will speak German during our panel discussion.
The last 6 months, it has been a subject which has entirely dominated the global business media, and the question really is, for anyone giving a talk like the one that I'm setting out on this evening, is to think of what we can usefully contribute that's new, that might gain your attention, that might grab and attract you in some way to this topic, which in some ways is mundane and everyday, but also in fact poses really quite serious questions of analysis. In fact, as inflation has begun, we've begun to ask ourselves whether we really understand what it is at all. And I want, in a sense, to dig into that question, to render what inflation is a little less obvious, perhaps, than it might seem at first. And to do that, I'm going to use a contrast between the United States, where I live and work much of the year, and Europe, where we are now, and where the problem of inflation presents itself in two rather different ways. But inflation dominates the headlines right now. First of all, as we've heard today from the ECB, is a question really about the classic inflation problem. It's somewhere between 8 and 10%. It could be rising more in Britain. It's going to head into the teens. And the question that central banks then have to ask is, how are they going to set interest rates? And this is one way of thinking about what inflation is. It's measured by the largest aggregate index that we have of prices. You can use something like the GDP deflator if you want, or other broad measures of prices. It's rising very rapidly right now, and central banks need to do something about it, because inflation is a monetary problem and central banks run monetary policy. Another way of thinking about inflation And this is what I really want to encourage you to do, is to try and distinguish between ways in which you think about this problem. Another way of thinking about inflation, as our chair introduced a minute ago, is just look at your electricity bill, right? Inflation for Europeans is above all an energy price shock problem. That is the core of the entire problem as far as they're concerned. And it is an urgent one which will affect Europe in the form of a social crisis. I'll say much more about that in a second. And that is really the third dimension of inflation, which increasingly is coming to the fore as the dominant preoccupation in Europe, up to and including, as I will say at the end, discussion of prices as the driver of a potential political crisis in Europe. We have a social democratic chancellor who at this moment is unafraid to invoke the possibility of mob violence a la Gilets jaunes sometime over the fall. This is an unusual situation for a social democrat to find themselves in. If you think of yourself as sympathetic to the socialist project, of course, those on the left will say, well, plus ça change. But these are the three different ways in which I think you can think of the inflation problem in the current moment. And if you live in the United States, as I do, the classic, the first way of thinking about inflation is the one that entirely dominates the discussion. We interpret consumer price index numbers down to a fraction of a decimal point. Whether it moves up or down by half a percentage point is enough to disturb the markets. We look at labour market reports to try and gauge what's going on in the finest grain detail, and all of the focus is on Jerome Powell and the Fed to see whether they will tweak interest rates or not, or it's on Lael Brainard, his chief of economic policy, who is making those decisions too. And that is the world in which inflation is treated in the United States right now. And it seems to me to be, in fact, despite the news we've had from the ECB today, quite a different world from the one that Europeans inhabit at this moment. Because in Europe, I think we're facing all three of these things at once. You referred to the multiple crises that afflict us, and I think that does precisely capture the reality of inflation. You don't know whether you should focus on the horror number, which is 8–9%, which breaks with 50 years of price stability. You don't know whether you should focus on the even more horrendous prospect, say in the UK, of energy bills going to £5,000 or £6,000 a year, right? Crippling pensioners. Or whether you should focus on the social turmoil that will unleash. The drama is much darker, it's much more gothic, it's associated with a much wider sense of destabilization. And as a result, whereas in the US all eyes are on technocratic decision-making, in Europe now I think this is becoming a much broader political and legitimatory crisis, which is why it's so urgent for us to talk about it. Nothing less than the social contract, the Gesellschaftsvertrag, is up for grabs at this moment. You might say, of course, well, that inflation, energy price shock, and social crisis are all just synonyms. They're all really just the same thing. So why would you make such a to-do about trying to distinguish them? And that's really the idea that I want to break in your minds this evening. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from this evening, it is the idea that, in fact, they're not the same thing. And it is precisely Europe's drama right now that they are all converging. Because in the United States right now, these are passed out, they're separate, which is a much more normal situation. And you do not grasp the severity of Europe's crisis at this moment until you realize the implications of them all three coming together. They appear that way in the current moment, in other words, as essentially synonyms for each other. But that is in itself a measure of the drama that we're in. It is the reason why, in some ways, and for good reason, the echoes of what happened 50 years ago, the echoes of the 1970s are so present. Because the last time we had all these three things converging, movement in the statistical measures which force central banks to act, concrete price shocks from specific parts of the standard of living, and the drama of social contestation was the 1970s. And I would like to refer you and encourage you to check out the Substack by my good friend, the British journalist Duncan Weldon, who made a very good argument, I think, about this being the way in which our current moment resembles the 70s. Now, saying this to Germans, because the 70s in Germany were not very dramatic, doesn't have the resonance that it does for somebody who comes from Britain or Italy, where the 70s were a moment of really fundamental turmoil, or the United States as well. But if there's a subtext to my talk this evening, one of the other things that you might want to take away is that Britain may be a country worth watching at this current moment. Many of us have gotten very tired with its political economy subsequent to Brexit. Who has patience for this crazy island of mad people who've embarked on this ridiculous adventure? The reason why it's quite interesting, and I share, and you can tell from my accent, the kind of horror I experience in the post-Brexit moment, but the reason why we may need to focus on that country is because there everything is going to be acted out even more extremely than within the European Union at this point. Inflation there is going to go into the teens, 15–16% is on the cards, and the energy price drama there is dramatic. The government The Liz Truss's government announced measures which amount to 5% of GDP today. 5% of GDP, this is wartime, this is COVID level spending that is going on there. So check out the British story, it's an important one. Why is it not obvious that an energy price shock should lead to general inflation? This is a sort of key element of the economic debate to take away, I think, at this moment. Why are these two things not identical with each other? Because in some say, you'd say, well, energy prices drive through the cost structure and that drives prices up. And so an energy price shock must be equal to an inflationary shock. Well, yes, at one level, but think about the flip side of this. If you're faced with gigantically escalating energy prices, are you going to be buying the goods which you jointly consume with the high energy? The answer to that is obviously no. So what you would expect is the price of goods that are associated with high energy consumption should fall. Some of those gigantic cars which people like to drive will tend to fall. The other squeeze that is going to happen, and this is going to be very dramatic, is that as energy prices go up and households cannot substitute out of energy, their disposable income goes down, and so their ability to buy anything else, to go out in the evenings, to go to the cinema, to go on holiday, falls, and as a result of that, there will be deflationary pressure across large parts of the rest of the economy. Unless something else happens to expand people's budgets, the effect of a huge shock to their energy costs is that their ability to buy anything else is shrunken, and as a result, we will see from the autumn in Europe mounting deflationary pressures in the rest of the economy. In other words, a recession brought on by an inflationary shock. As the volume of energy trading measured in relation to GDP, and this is a staggering number I came across the other day, surges from 1% of EU GDP to 10% of GDP. There is a huge redistribution of purchasing power going on, which will suck demand out of other sectors and cause deflationary effects there. Another way of thinking about this effect is to think of this nationally. If you're the United States, which is a net self-sufficient in energy, if you're the United States and you're not self-sufficient in energy, then a world energy shock like the one that we're experiencing now has a net neutral effect on the American economy. It simply shuffles purchasing power from Connecticut, which consumes energy, to Texas, which produces energy. It's literally a redistribution within the national economy of the United States. If you want to understand the logic of global energy markets in the world at this moment, this graph here is a very important one because the United States disappears as a consumer of energy on net in the global economy. Why? Because of fracking. This is the story of fracking. With fracking, America becomes self-sufficient in energy. That means the American economy does not suffer a net hit from global rising energy prices. In Europe, which is of course a huge net energy importer, the effect of a rise in global energy prices is simply to suck demand out of the European economy and to transfer it to the Middle East, to the United States, or of course, to our horror, to Russia, whose revenues from not so much gas but from oil have surged as a result of the world price shock in energy. So this is another way of thinking about the way in which a rise in energy prices does not produce on aggregate an inflationary push in an economy like Europe, which imports its energy, but in fact produces a squeeze on the rest of economic activity. So that's one, I think, idea to break, that an energy cost crisis drives directly towards an inflationary outcome. That may not be our future in Europe. It may, in fact, be that an energy price surge produces a deflationary outcome in Europe in the imminent future in terms of a recessionary shock. The second question to really dig into is the cost of living and social crisis, and to ask ourselves to what extent this is really a problem of inflation or whether it's really structurally a problem of inequality and poverty. Obviously, a squeeze to the standard of living happens because wages are not keeping up with prices, and that is not news in the Eurozone. Ever since 2020, wages have not kept track with prices in the Eurozone. There has been a real wage squeeze going on now for more than a year. It's becoming much more dramatic, of course, as a result of the current circumstance. And a standard of living squeeze becomes a social crisis if the extent of inequality in affluent societies is such that substantial minorities of people are forced below minimum living standards as a result of this inequality in movement between wages and prices. This is the example of us possibly introducing a tax, I don't know, for private swimming pools or giant SUVs. Do we really care about the rising cost of living for people in that kind of social class? It may be a political problem, but it's not a social crisis. It is the crisis at the bottom, and again, I'm illustrating this with British data because it's so graphic there. 14 million people may find themselves below the poverty line in the UK by the end of this year. 14 million people, that's about a quarter of the population below the poverty line as a result of this shock. But what's happening here is that inflation is, if you like, exposing structural problems which lie much deeper, which are to do essentially with inequality, with poverty, and the inadequacy of the welfare system. It's not an inflation problem as such, it's an inequality and poverty problem exposed by the inflationary dynamic. And this leads me to what might strike many of you in the room as a sort of paradoxical conclusion, but it's a paradoxical conclusion that's crucial for understanding the fundamental difference between the American and the European situation at this moment. In the United States right now, the United States Federal Reserve has more of an inflation problem than the ECB because it has less of a social crisis. Why does this make sense? It has a bigger inflationary problem because it has less of a social crisis, because the logic of inflation in the United States right now is fundamentally different from that in Europe. Let's just go through the logical steps. A true inflation, as economists define it, is a change in the price of all goods and services. All goods and services. And what is a wage? A wage is the price of labor. When we conventionally define inflation as only the price of goods, we effectively exclude labor from that calculation. For an economist, an inflation is when prices and wages go up. So a cost of living squeeze, an attendant social crisis in which prices go up but wages don't adjust, is de facto evidence essentially of an incomplete or partial inflationary process. It means that the price of labor is not rising in line with the price of goods. It means, therefore, that a society is not truly experiencing a comprehensive inflation at all, but a one-sided price push at the expense of society. It's basically just a gigantic redistributional mechanism. Inflation in that sense. It's just basically taking purchasing power away from wage earners and transferring it to the producers of goods. And as a result of that, and this is another way of stating the conclusion I reached earlier on, there is an extent to which a cost of living, social crisis producing price adjustment has a tendency to self-extinguish. Because as real incomes are squeezed, purchasing power collapses, and we will see this playing out in the fall as consumer expectations in Europe go off a cliff. We've not seen this before. Consumption will come down, the economy will contract, and we will see dramatic recessionary tendencies from that side of the equation. Flip this on its head, and you have the current American situation. If wages do keep up with prices, if real wages therefore fall less, and you have less of a social crisis, then inflation is more general and less likely to be self-extinguishing, and that is the reason why the Federal Reserve is on edge the way it is, because what we're seeing in the United States right now is what we're not seeing in Europe so far, which is a huge surge in nominal wages, especially at the bottom end of the labor market. It's really dramatic, and you can see the numbers here. So real wages in America are not shrinking as much. We don't have the social crisis, but the central bank is much more panicked, because what this points to is an avalanche-like movement across society. Now, you might say to yourself, has Adam Tooze gone away and discovered like an upsurging class struggle in the United States in the last 18 months, which would be ridiculous, despite all the headlines about the organizing success of trade unions at Starbucks and Amazon. I promise you it's not happened. The largest labor dispute in the United States in the fall in 2021 was on my campus at Columbia University between the university and the graduate students. America is not witnessing a huge upsurge or shift in the balance of class power. But what America and Europe are experiencing in a very fascinating way are the consequences of two radically different ways of dealing with the COVID crisis. This is the story that Olaf Scholz is so proud of as Chancellor. On the left-hand side, you have the American experience of the labor market shock of COVID. You can see Europe and America have very similar degrees of lost working hours, around about 20% in both cases. In the United States case, it's all in unemployment, the blue chunk. In other words, people were fired, And now they have to be rehired. And as employers collectively try to rehire literally millions of individual workers, even without a unionization drive, the workers gain individual bargaining power. They argue for higher wages, and that is the effect that we're seeing. It's like a mass, atomized shift in the balance of bargaining power between employers and workers. It will evaporate as soon as the demand is gone, and that is what the Fed is bargaining on. The effect of the short-time working system in Europe is that workers never acquired that bargaining power. They were never pushed out of their jobs, so they stayed in their jobs. They're basically just sitting on their existing contracts. There is no basis for renegotiation, and so we see a much, much calmer development of wage income. But this is what the Fed is now doing. The Fed is driving hard to, in a classic way, stop this market-driven surge in nominal wages so as to calm inflation down. Now, once you've got this clear about this distinction between different types of inflation, the next question you might ask is, if prices and wages go up in the sort of inflation the US is experiencing, why would you care about it? Because after all, everyone's making out. Employers are raising their prices, workers are raising their wages, real incomes are staying level. From the point of view of social distribution, for instance, this is all good. Everyone's on the level. Well, there are losers, and they are the classic losers of inflation, and those are the savers, the holders of nominal assets, the holders of bonds, the classic losers in a rapid inflationary process. So the cynical conclusion that you reach, if you push this analysis to its conclusion, is that the Fed in the United States right now is engaging in the most classic logic of inflationary stabilization, which is to stabilize prices by means of raising unemployment, pushing back against this atomistic empowerment of American workers so as to stabilize financial markets. That is essentially the logic, transparently as that, in the United States. It is, as they will euphemistically say, raising rates to cool down the labor market, which means making people at the margin more unemployed, which basically means, in the American case, black men, who are the first people out of the labor market and the last people in. And that is the logic by which they will cool the labor market, take the inflationary pressure down, stabilize bond markets. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say, in a market economy like the United States, is what the commitment to price stability means. That's what that bargain effectively implies. And that is the normal mechanism of ordinary transmission in monetary policy. Europe's situation is far worse than that. If you thought that sounded bad, Europe's situation is far worse than that. Because if Europe had this problem, the ECB's decision today would be the big news. And we all know perfectly well the big news is not what the ECB did today, but what the governments of Europe will decide tomorrow. In Europe, we're dealing with a much bigger problem. Now, we could be in an even worse situation. And it's worth saying this, because the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, doesn't just make monetary policy for the United States. The Federal Reserve makes global monetary policy. And as American interest rates go up, the state standing of low-income countries and emerging markets around the world gets crushed because their debt burden goes up, the dollar strengthens, the cost of their imports rises, and in an extreme case, you end up in Sri Lanka's position earlier this year, unable to pay your debts, unable to pay for your imports. And when we talk about inflationary crises and energy crises, it's important to just anchor ourselves realistically against the global backdrop that says that's what it looks like when it gets really bad. So let's just put that there. If America is in the position of doing ordinary monetary policy, and Sri Lanka is in the position of experiencing a classic low-income country, most vulnerable in the global system problem, the situation of Europe right now is somewhere in between. You will have noticed, perhaps, some stories in the news that as of today, the euro stands at 1 to the dollar. So the euro is feeling the pinch that emerging market currencies are feeling too. The Fed makes monetary policy for everyone, including the Europeans. One of the reasons why the ECB had to do what it did today was to match the Fed. The Fed's doing 75 basic points, so 0.75% of 1%, so the ECB has to do the same thing. But of course, in Europe, that is basically buffered, right? The people who joined the euro to gain protection against currency crises made the right gamble. They got protection against currency crisis. That's not one of their issues. They have a whole range of other issues to deal with. The fact the euro is at parity against the dollar is the last thing in the world anyone in Europe ought to be worried about. And when the ECB starts worrying about it, you know they've really lost the plot. That is beside the point. What matters right now is the energy price shock and the attendant social crises. Now, if we go back to this trio of problems, the way an economist, an economic policy maker looks at this is to follow what's called Tinbergen's law. You've got three problems, you've got three targets, so what you need is three instruments. If you don't have as many instruments as you've got problems, you're going to have a trade-off issue because you're going to use one instrument to fix two problems, like the interest rate to fix both unemployment and inflation, and then you're going to have a trade-off. We call it the Phillips curve. If you've got enough instruments for each problem, you can target each problem with an instrument. And in the technocrats' mind right now, when they are not out of their minds with panic, when they are coolly sitting down and looking at the Europeans' problem, they allocate an instrument to each one of these problems. We've already spoken about one. The ECB is targeting the inflation rate. And when you ask them, why the hell did you do what you did today? How is this going to help? They'll say, I see a problem. It's 8 going on 10% inflation. I have one instrument. It's the interest rate, and I'm going to use it. Until you make that problem going away, I'm pulling my interest rate lever. That's going to be their answer. They're going to run all for long until something happens. But what are we going to do about the other two dimensions of the problem? We need other instruments. And the answers we're already clear, and this is what I hope we're going to spend most of our evening talking about, is what we're going to do on the other side. Because on the social crisis side, it's clear that we need to do income supplements, tax benefits of various types to hit that problem. And as so far as we're going to address the energy price surge directly, we need to take measures that address energy markets, price caps, support for energy companies, up to and including, and let's open the bandwidth of debate here. If you talk to the people in Leipzig on Monday, what they wanted to do was put economic sanctions against Russia on the table too. Right? That is a legitimate extension of this argument. We may agree or disagree, but they're joining up the dots. It's not a crazy thing to do. The question, of course, is how we balance all these policies out against each other, which I'm sure is going to be the frame of our conversation this evening, and it is what every government in Europe is having to do right now. So I want, in the last few minutes of my talk, simply to sketch some of the dilemmas we face. Because as neat as this is, one problem, one instrument, one problem, another instrument. The problem is these things interact with each other, and the scale of the interventions that are necessary at this point is gigantic, and we are only just beginning to come to terms with this. This is the first session I've done on this problem publicly. It is going to dominate the agenda. We are embarked on a historic experiment. We should be clear about this. To measure how historic, look at this. Many of you will have followed this debate. This is Isabella Weber, a brave young German economist who, in the pages of The Guardian in December, wrote a, I thought, quite ill-advised piece at the time saying we should use price controls to prevent inflation in Europe. Didn't make much sense to me at the time. I reviewed her book very kindly. I love it. It's great about China. I couldn't see why it would matter right now. And this is the FT this week. Right? So price controls are on the agenda. And it's a little bit like the papacy advocating birth control. Right? This is not supposed to happen. We were supposed to have gotten over the price controls thing. We lecture every single emerging market and low-income country in the world that they must give up price controls on fossil fuels. It's an unspeakably bad thing to be doing. We all know it. Right? But we're doing it anyway, and we're going to do it on a huge scale, and it's already happening. And this is a measure of just how messed up and how confused this crisis has made the policy discussion, because I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad choice, but it is a very complicated choice to make. Why are price controls such a terrible idea? Because they remove the incentive to economize on the thing that you're controlling the price of. So you can regulate that problem by only protecting a certain amount. I can see we're already getting to get into debate. Higher income households and firms consume more energy, so the more price you control, the more benefit they get. It reduces the incentive to supply, ultimately. If you actually control the supply price as well, the suppliers won't provide you any, so then you're actually going to have to span the gap between the price you pay to the supplier and what the consumer pays, and the government is on the hook for that, so it becomes a huge fiscal problem, and it will therefore create gigantic fiscal issues. This is the problem in emerging markets. It's the problem that Argentina has. It's one of the big issues with the IMF. Why do you do price controls? Because the social pain's unbearable. Right? You do them because you don't think the market's actually sending any reasonable signals or anything more. We don't really need the price for gas to go any higher than it currently is for us to realize there's not enough gas. There's not extra information coming from that. You may think the price is driven by speculators and want to intervene for that reason. But I think most importantly right now, and it's an overtly political reason, somebody has to show they're in control of this gigantic crisis. And the thing that consumers are freaked out about is the price and the bill. And it doesn't help to say to them, right, you know what we're going to do because economists tell us to? We're going to subsidize your income instead. People simply do not find that a credible answer to the problem. It's really striking. Because economists all over the world would say, no, you shouldn't do that. Don't control prices for all of the reasons we started with. And I'm just taking you around this decision tree to see how confusing and like a dilemma this is. Don't control prices because it's inefficient, it subsidizes the wrong people. Don't do that. Subsidize the people who need it directly. Give low-income households higher incomes. That makes sense. That's efficient. That's the socially equitable way to do this. The problem is that if you only give benefits to low-income households, you stigmatize them. If the take-up amongst disadvantaged groups, because disadvantaged groups suffer multiple overlapping disadvantages, they're not best placed to actually empower themselves to claim benefits, so they don't. The targeting error is inevitable. It's structural. You aren't always going to be able to find just people that you need to support them. And finally, if welfare is only for poor people, it will ultimately be weakly politically anchored and at risk of cuts, of slicing. There will not be collective ownership. And so I think, though it's much less efficient, it makes political sense in a deep way, and this is not something to dismiss easily, as from a technocratic point of view, to actually have a blend of general measures which bring everyone in, as inefficient as that may be, with targeted measures which support people. So you can see all of the trade-offs that we're having to make. What we have very rarely seen so far is any conversation about that fundamental problem, the problem of the structural disadvantage of the weakness in the welfare state, which creates the social crisis in the first place, which is why I harped on this obvious problem at the beginning. Why is it that there are people so disadvantaged in our society that a rising energy bill crushes them? That should be an indictment of the societies we live in. How do we give one question that could be asked to address inflation is how we empower working people and the recipient of social welfare to fight it themselves by making claims and empowering to make claims. Rather than discussing in a technocratic fashion who gets what and how we allocate from above, empower people to claim from below. The terrifying thing, and it's spelled out extraordinarily explicitly in the discussions of economists, is that economists around the world are quite explicitly committed to the project of making sure that doesn't happen. Why? And I don't say this in a conspiratorial tone. The BIS spells it out for you in econometric terms. They will literally say the longer an inflation burns, the higher the tendency of people to unionize in trade unions. The more union strength you have, the larger the collective bargaining power. Once the collective bargaining power is there, inflationary expectations become unanchored. Therefore, we should act against inflation hard now to stop that process from happening. Spelled out in black and white in the most recent report of the BIS. In so many words, with all of the econometrics to prove the connection. And why would you want to do that? Because you might say, from the point of view of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung or IG Metall, what's wrong with more empowerment? The answer of the technocrat is, because that makes my job incredibly difficult. Because unanchored inflationary expectations are the nightmare of the 1970s. And I would much rather a world in which I freely dispose of the income and wealth distribution and pick who I give resources to. And I can, of course, be a benign technocrat and give them to the right people. But the crucial thing is I remain in control of the process. Because if the process is not controlled, then the struggle of mistrust within society will require me to do really, really nasty things to demonstrate that I'm serious about inflation control. This is literally how it goes. I'm going to have to prove I'm a conservative beast by doing beastly things, because if we actually have a play of social forces in societies, you won't trust me to pull the trigger when I have to. It's really an incredibly perverse logic. But it's playing out before our very eyes in moments like this, where you have the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, as I referred to earlier on, invoking the possibility of the Gilets jaunes as a force that will force and remove control of policy from the government. And that is the reason why the government must act. It's this extraordinary kind of cycle that we're currently in, where the question could be, how do we restructure society to give people voice so they can defend themselves more proactively? The question is, why I mean this quite seriously, therefore, this is really posing questions of the social contract, not just in the distributional sense, but in the question of the distribution of political power. Who at this moment has the right to decide is also up for grabs. What is clear, and this really brings things to a conclusion, is that whatever way we go, we are now talking about historically large amounts of money that is going to have to be mobilized to fill these gaps between the prices that consumers pay and the prices the global market is demanding. This is a FT compilation from a couple of weeks ago. It's already completely out of date. This was Entlastungspaket number 3. This takes you to 2.5% for Germany. And this is Liz Truss's package this morning. It takes you closer to 3 or even larger. The package they announced today takes you off this graph. Britain is now moving into a zone which is even larger. And so we are talking now about a historic fiscal challenge. And the question is, how is this going to be managed? And this is the final observation that I'll end with. in general inflations of prices and wages, as in the United States, which conform quite closely to what economists think of as inflations, which is all prices and wages moving against monetary assets which remain fixed, in which the inflation, therefore, is a challenge to monetary stability, which you meet with central bank action, the story remains confined within a world of a market moving, financial assets at stake, and the central bank using interest rates to stabilize the story. In the world that we are in Europe right now, when we're dealing with a cost of living shock, which is fundamental, is existential, and is posing basic questions about the social order and the political order indeed, there is no way in which the government as such cannot become involved. This cannot be handed off anymore to the central bank. And what then happens, however, is a shock to the bond market, not from the demand side, because people don't want to hold bonds because the inflation is eating away at their value, but because governments are going to have to issue bonds to the tune of several percentage points of GDP. And ladies and gentlemen, when that question is posed in Europe, we all know where that leads. We are not going to be able to get past a conversation about the fiscal constitution of Europe in this crisis. Anyone who believes going into this that this can be contained is in March, April stage 2020 denial. That was the stage the last German government, Angela Merkel with Olaf Scholz in the finance ministry, was in March and April 2020, and Europe's survival depended on Berlin changing its mind on this issue. That is the critical moment in May when the Macron and Merkel governments got together with Scholz and Bruno Le Maire brokering the deal. That is the crucial moment. That's the test that Europe passed. In 2020, the German government explicitly, you can talk to every German diplomat in the world and they'll tell you the same story, defined that as an emergency, an exceptional European action defined by the COVID crisis. Well, if this isn't an exceptional emergency, if indeed Scholz is not right to say that we now live in the site of Zeitenwende, in other words, times have changed, not just once, but fundamentally, and you think you can, as it were, get through this with a simple improvisation, we're really, at that stage, we're in denial, right? And the question really will be how long it will take before the decision makers in Europe realize the scale of this and what damage will be done along the way. And the test will start tomorrow when we see how coherent this package is. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward very much to the discussion.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank. Adam, ist es an?
Thank you, Adam.
Wenn Sie
Thank you, Adam Tooze. Maybe you can
und wir
go over there and have a seat, and we will start our panel discussion. There are two more guests, Mrs. Katharina Uttermühl.
Katharina Uttermühl, sie ist
Katharina Uttermühl. She is an economist by training and works at Allianz SE.
Zorn, ist Ökonom.
And Amand Zorn, he's a member of the Bundestag and he's a member of the Finance Committee and the deputy spokesperson of the Finance Working Group of the SPD Parliamentary Group.
Jetzt könnten wir gleich mit den Structural Changes anfangen, die Herr Tooze vorgestellt
So we could start by discussing the structural changes mentioned by Mr. Tooze. But I would like to comment on what Mr. Tooze has just said. An additional 75
Das hörte sich ja ebenso an, als
points.
einfach immer das, was die USA machen, und dann sind wir jetzt.
So usually he says we do what the United States are doing, so have we already priced that in, so it won't matter any longer, or
Wellen geschlagen mit
this had an impact on economics. Do you think that there will be an impact, and what will this impact be? I hope my microphone is working as well. I would have loved to listen to you much longer. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Ja, zur EZB
As far as the
heute 75
ECB is concerned,
diesen 75 Basisclub auch beitreten, weil sie
they have to announce the 0.75%, and if they don't meet market expectations, this would have been a burden for the euro, and then this might have led to surging energy prices, and then
noch mehr erhöhen muss.
there would have there would have been another increase in base rates later on if they hadn't done so. The question is, who's the biggest hawk?
Ich denke, es wird auch noch
And I think,
auch in
well, it might go on like this until we're going to see a recession, because I agree there will be a recession by the end of the year. I'm sure we will reach about 2%. And
Soll ich auch was dazu sagen? Ja, also ich glaube, der Schritt heute war,
well,
wenn ich das einschätzen darf, würde aber grundsätzlich
I believe that this was the right step to take, but nevertheless, I think, well, these are the limits of what fiscal policy in Europe can do. And Professor Tooze has explained this very well, and this is what I also said in my speeches to the Bundestag. This crisis cannot be solved by fiscal policy only. We have entered into a crisis that started a number of years ago, and now the ECB is under a lot of pressure, and people expect them to use new instruments or tools or increasing interest rates. And this might be justified looking at 0% interest rates. I don't know whether 2% or 2.5% are the right thing to do, but fiscal policy alone cannot be the solution to this crisis.
Hier schon wieder ein sogenanntes Game of Chicken ausgebrochen ist.
Well, one interpretation might be that there is a game of chicken. This is a well-known James Dean film.
Bremst zuerst.
Two cars having a chicken race, and if there is a game of chicken, well,
EZB im Grunde
the
bis die Regierung
ECB will raise interest rates until there will be a reform of the energy sector in Europe, putting a break to prices.
vor allem
There is a
während der Eurokrise
tradition that we have seen. Jean-Claude Juncker, for example,
fiskalpolitische
well, he had a systematical chicken race for a number of years. He wanted to see reforms, and only afterwards the ECB was prepared to enter into the market buying bonds. This is what why Draghi said, I will do whatever it takes. So always said this is a turning era, and
und das ist, glaube ich, das
I think
weil das
this is exactly the game we are playing now, because the ECB definitely agrees with you. This is not a problem that they can solve, but they need governments to take action in
wie man sich das
order to
also sie müssen
help them putting on the brake, because they need to respond. If there is an inflation of 8% and real interest rates are quite complex, let's say we achieve 2 or 2.5% and inflation goes down to 7%, then
unter diesen Umständen ist
the actual interest rate is minus 5%. So they cannot remain passive. This is not something they can afford to do. And you need to bear in mind that they have used this
in ihrem
protection instrument
also vom Tisch genommen. Italien ist gedeckt
in order to take Italy off the table.
in diesem Moment.
And of course, hawks are
Sehr gut verstehen, dass sie im Herbst
demanding more action. Of course, they cannot do this again in autumn, because
das ist
there will be bad news in autumn, so it will getting more complex. So they have this window of opportunity, and they have to do it right now, and afterwards they can take a softer approach. This is what I would hope for.
nachfragen darf. Heute hat Christine Lagarde ja sogar in der
Christine Lagarde said today,
klar, dass jetzt
we
nicht
cannot do anything about the problem, because the steps that we are going to take will not help to reduce inflation going down to 2%. But this is also about expectations management, and they need to do something about it, because their credibility is at stake. Even if there's two-digit inflation, they cannot go on with
Aber dann
with the same fiscal policy. But in this case, it was not only the United States doing the same thing, but the ECB,
wie der US
want different things, and maybe the result would be the same. Maybe they should have taken 77 points.
die letzte These von Herrn Thus aufgreifen
But I would like to talk about the last idea of Mr. Tooze,
und mit diesem und jenen und
relief packages and small measures will not help us, and we need structural change. We need to do more. And Mrs. Hutemal, you said a very similar thing. What does it actually mean? What kind of structural changes
geben.
do we need?
Die Stelle ist, wenn wir jetzt jemandem erklären,
And the other question that I have is,
noch, aber
well, let's say there is this relief package, but we need structural change, and this will take a long time to do this in Germany, then it will not be working out. So this is a question to you.
Also strukturelle Veränderungen, ja, das dauert in Deutschland normalerweise.
Yes, structural changes take time in Germany.
Die Antwort, also das leider glaube ich, dass es
Unfortunately, that is not a good scenario.
ja,
I'm afraid that for the German economy, there will be a rather
ankommen.
abrupt structural change. And I didn't want to come up with the apocalyptic scenario. And thank you for taking that over.
Ich glaube, dass wir in dieser Krise
But I think
stärker treffen als
this
die
crisis will hit us more than the euro crisis.
Finanzkrise.
It will hit us more than the
Strukturellen
large financial crisis. I think there will be structural headwind. We will have higher energy prices. We will also have higher interest rates. There'll be more global
Gegenhandel, an dem wir ja auch,
uncertainty, which is not very conducive to global trade.
was wir auch schon überall gehört haben,
And what we're going to see this winter,
das ist eine Art,
potential production stops.
aber nicht, dass nächstes Jahr
I think this is just the beginning, because I do not expect that energy prices will drop again dramatically next year. I think we have to assume that this is a long-term crisis. It's not like COVID
aber das ist eine Krise, mit der wir länger
that had a limited duration, but this will be a long-term crisis.
relativ schnell kommen.
And that's why structural change needs to happen very soon.
Da ist die Politik wahnsinnig gefordert und ich
The
glaube,
question is now, what can politics do?
überwältigt, weil
My feeling is that policymakers feel overtasked at the moment. At the moment, we're just putting band-aid
abzufedern,
on everything.
durch die Inflation
And we're just trying to deal with the current pain that people feel. But if there is going to be a recession, and if you realize that we are weaker after the crisis, then I think we need to come up with more fundamental answers.
eine strukturelle
Okay, could you give me an example of a structural change that would need to take place now?
nochmal, ich glaube, es sind strukturelle Veränderungen, die stattfinden.
Once again,
Beispielsweise Energie
structural changes will happen, like, for example, energy-intensive industries might not have a future
wohler fühlen,
here
beispielsweise
or may want to relocate.
so hart betroffen sind.
For example, in the US, that are not as hard hit by the energy shock.
Wir müssen dann schauen, dass wir in
And then we, as a country, need to deal with that.
investieren,
We
die
need to invest in activities that have a higher added value.
Eltern in andere Bereiche. Wir
That means we need to move up to other areas, invest more in green
in
technologies.
Deutschland produziert
And
werden.
perhaps we don't have to produce steel in Germany anymore, which will become impossible anyway with the high energy prices, unless it's green steel. But for that to happen, we need to invest, and we're not really investing much now, which is of course always difficult when you're in a crisis.
als Teil der Ampelkoalition das tun.
I would say as part of the government coalition, we are doing this. We look at the different areas,
Dass wir uns
and the professor described all of this.
für die hohen Preise. Auch im Deutschen Bundestag gibt es da durchaus
And I think we agreed on the reasons for the high prices we're seeing now.
diesen Energiesektor rausnehmen. Die hohen
If in Germany we focus on the energy sector and high energy prices,
kurzfristig Entlastung.
then we're doing something to stop this. We have the relief packages, and yes, of course, they are not about structural change, but the
Besten
goal is
nicht immer
to
so schnell wie möglich präzise
offer, in a targeted way,
Unternehmen
support to those people and those companies that suffer most from the high energy
zu den
prices.
Entlastungspakete.
And this is something we're fixing now with the relief packages.
Targeting
And to be sure, not everything is perfect, and maybe the targeting is not perfect, but we are doing something.
machen wir auch. Wir wissen,
And yes, we do need structural change, and we're working on it. We know that gas prices were way too low in the past, and we know that. And we have a very intensive energy industry here in Europe. We want to phase out of energy-intensive industries,
Veränderung, von dem wir
and
reden.
that's very clear in our coalition agreement.
Dafür zu sorgen, dass wir den Ausbau von
We are now on the way to promoting the expansion of renewables.
von heute auf morgen so geht mit
And of course, that's not going to be possible overnight here in Germany,
Genehmigungsverfahren.
but we are
Also
in
mittelfristig
the process of accelerating approval procedures and so on. And in the medium and long term, the goal is to use more renewables. That's not only good for the environment, it will also cost less.
transition phase.
But then there will be a transition phase between the short-term
Würde ich sagen, ist die Regierung
support and the long-term goals. But there too, I would say the government is quite active.
und hat das auch
The
eindrucksvoll
federal chancellor has said it repeatedly. We're now building the LNG terminals. That will take some time. And of course, LNG is more expensive than gas from Russia. But
gesagt.
this is an example of what we're doing.
Satz. Ich weiß, Politiker reden
And we are also in the process of fixing the social crisis that you mentioned.
diese drei Komponenten zu
But looking at the energy prices, that is an example where you see how we're coming up with short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions.
Die Frage mit einknüpfen.
Mr. Toos, I wanted to ask you something.
Wir machen zwar schon eine strukturelle Veränderung bei
So yes, we are working on structural changes in the energy markets,
industrielle Veränderung.
but you weren't only talking about industrial transformation.
Biden, der Präsident, gesagt, wenn
Joe Biden, the US president, said,
pay them better,
if you look for more workers, pay them better.
einfach die Gewerkschaften stützen. Ist das
Wouldn't that mean that in Germany we should support the trade unions more?
Ich verspreche, dass ich darauf zurückkomme. Ich möchte nur ganz
Now, I promise to come back to your question, but let me just add a comment on energy costs
Industrialisierung.
and let's call it deindustrialization.
Die
Of course, that's a word that people don't like to hear. But that's what it is.
Aber man sollte
We need to take this problem very seriously, but we must not be intimidated by the lobbyists.
im Frühjahr schon los.
The debate started with the boycott discussion in the spring. We had all these horrible news saying that BASF would go down if we don't have any Russian gas anymore. But then there is the
Das Gas aus
cynical statement that people say the German industry was only so successful because it had access to cheap Russian gas. And there is actually no empirical proof of that. Yes, gas in Europe is more expensive than the gas in Texas, and the gas in Texas or the US costs nothing. But if you compare gas prices to Asia,
wir müssen ja bei der Inflation bleiben, nicht zu
Ja,
tief in den Energie.
let's not just focus on the energy sector. Yes, but I am just pointing out what structural changes will entail.
Form, dass das irgendwie ein deutscher Sonderweg ist.
And although there will be a difficult impact for Germany, it's not only Germany that is affected.
Im Herbst unter diesem
Other industries, other regions like East Asia, they will all suffer from the high LNG prices.
Kohle zuschalten.
The problem is they can use
Die strukturelle
coal,
Veränderung, die jetzt wirklich ansteht, ist, dass die CBAM-Diskussion, also die Carbon Border Adjustment,
but the carbon border adjustment discussion also needs to take place, meaning
damit müssen wir jetzt ernst
collecting a levy on CO2-intensive goods. That's something we also need to discuss if we really want to see a green revolution. But I wanted to say something else.
weil wir haben hier einen Vertreter des IG Metalls präsent.
In Germany, actually there is somebody from the Metal Workers Union here in Germany, and the trade unions are still going strong in Germany.
Treiben.
They are able to carry out collective negotiations.
Unter anderem in Amerika fehlt diese
In the US, there is no such system, and the trade unions aren't as powerful. Now, what I want to say is this.
sozialen Krisen, die sich daraus
The
ergeben,
social crises arising from inflation are not
der Entmachtung der Arbeiterschaft seit
natural development. It's also a result of the weakening of the trade unions in the 1970s.
in der Gesellschaft und in der Wirtschaft. Und eine Antwort auf die Inflation
And one response to inflation could be not to handle this in a top-down manner, but actually bottom-up, to use these counterforces and strengthen them.
wird die ökonomische Politik kompliziert.
And if we do that, economic policy becomes more complicated, but it also becomes more democratic because more people have a say.
Notbehelf verstehen.
And it shouldn't just be considered a fallback option.
Unter
something that you might consider doing in a crisis,
hin zu den
but there should be a general opening of the political process to more diverse interests. This all goes back to the 1960s and 70s.
Sozialdemokratie und der Linken
And if we look at the
etwas mit der Entmachtung
structural crisis of the left-wing parties and the social democratic parties, then that is directly connected to the weakening of the trade unions. And we see very acutely what we've lost because of that in the UK and the US.
zumindest zu der
And that was my point. Why aren't we even discussing this?
Aktion angekündigt und gemacht, Wirtschaft, Gewerkschaften, Politik.
Yeah, I mean, but we said we're going to all work together, policymakers, the business community and trade unions, and that will fix it. But nobody talks about this collaboration anymore, right?
Aktion ist wichtig, in so
No, I think concerted action of this type is very important
Arbeitnehmerinnen und Arbeitnehmervertretungen und Arbeitgeber
because the
Lösungen nachzudenken.
employers and employees and policymakers all need to find solutions together. But what you're describing here, Professor, is happening. I come from Frankfurt,
Fliegt, der
and perhaps you know Frankfurt Main Airport,
stattfinden, sehr hart geführt werden. Und ich finde,
and the collective negotiations there are very fierce.
in der
At Frankfurt Airport, we had short-time work and furlough.
Mitarbeiter mit sehr angenehmen
A lot of
Pakete verabschiedet wurden.
workers actually had a quite comfortable life, didn't work, but got most of their money, also because the airport company considered
Zahlen sich so negativ verändert haben. Und was ist passiert? Dass viele diese Fachkräfte
they
andere Jobs gefunden haben, bessere Jobs gefunden
might not need all of these people anymore. Many left the company
haben, unter anderem Lufthansa.
and found other work. But
Schwierigkeiten,
now we're in a situation where the airport company finds it very difficult to rehire people.
Arbeitnehmerinnen und Arbeitnehmer genau hart in die Verhandlung reingehen, weil die ganz genau wissen, dass wir ein Momentum haben, wo sie
But it is true, at the moment, I think the employees realize that they are in a strengthened position and they can negotiate better wages.
nichts damit zu
And that means what Mr. Toos described is happening as we speak.
tun, auch nicht entsprechend etwas
But it doesn't mean that we don't need any concerted action anymore.
Antwort auf die
Yes, and that is a constructive response that might help us avoid the yellow vests.
Weise von oben das Volk richtig füttern, sondern
And it's a better way of solving that crisis. It's about opening up new pathways of participation in society.
gewerkschaftliche
For
Organisationen
practical reasons, for historical reasons, trade unions have an important role to play.
sollte nicht
If we want to talk about populism,
der Kollektivarbeiterschaft
we shouldn't even, we should not deny the weakening of organizations like trade unions.
gemacht hat, dann ist
And if we conjure up
die Antwort darauf
the
diese kollektive
specter of
Entscheidungsfindung
an extremist revolution, then we must make sure that these pragmatic and rational forces are being strengthened.
Doch einen wichtigen Punkt bekommen, nämlich den schönen Entlastungspaketen. Auch wenn Sie
Now, let us move on to the relief packages, although you just called them Band-Aid.
die Leute nicht sagen, irgendwie
My feeling is
der nächsten Gewerkschaft an, weil dann
not that people are saying right now, oh, let me join the trade union, because that will help me to negotiate better wages.
Rechnung nicht bezahlt,
But people just say, I can't pay my bills.
Gewerkschaftsausweis
And they take to the streets and they're asking for more money,
hat gesagt,
wherever that comes from.
Entlastungspakete machen wir das so,
And now one of the church welfare organizations said
über mehrere Monate
the lowest 10%
€100 pro Monat,
of our workers get 100 euros per month.
nix.
That will amount to a total of
das wäre
5.4 million. The wealthy will not get anything. Does that sound like a suitable approach to you?
Die Diakonie hat das vorgeschlagen.
Entlastungspaket 3.
Okay, now
Professor,
let's come back to relief package number 3. There's something that people sometimes forget to mention. There is something that refers to trade unions.
Arbeitnehmervertretung
We are saying here,
eine Pauschale
if the employers and employees can agree on paying a lump sum,
dafür,
then
sich in
an
Gewerkschaften
amount of up to 3,000 euros will be tax-free.
ihre Rechte
So we're opening up a way for the social partners to negotiate such a tax-free allowance.
Ich will aber noch mal
About the example you mentioned, I don't know enough about this.
besonders darauf geachtet, dass
But I can tell you that with the third relief package,
Entlastung profitiert.
we tried to make sure
So. Dass insbesondere die Menschen,
that those
die Steuererleichterung
who don't benefit from tax breaks
davon haben. Das sieht man tatsächlich im
will
Entlastungs
benefit from this package. That's very much reflected in that package. I mean, take
bei den
pensioners,
Paketen zuvor
university students.
berücksichtigt hatten, nicht in diesem Maße
They weren't considered before,
auch teilweise jetzt
and now
betrachtet werden. Und
they also receive financial support.
als unterschätzt wahrnehme, ist die Frage,
And there's another question that we are perhaps underestimating in its importance, and that's a global minimum tax.
nicht hoch genug loben, ehrlich gesagt, weil die gesamte
I think that's a very important idea,
gerade eigentlich so ein bisschen Rückenwind verloren hat.
because this discussion about a global minimum tax had really lost some momentum.
In der Europäischen Union mit Polen und Ungarn 2 Länder gibt, die
And in Europe, with Poland and Hungary, there were two countries who didn't really
in Deutschland zu machen, dann belebt
budge on this topic.
globale Debatte immer wieder und sorgen eigentlich dafür, dass
So
dort
it's good that we are reviving this global debate. It might mean that we can raise more money
abgehauen. Ich würde aber
and it will help national budgets.
und
Okay, but let's remain in Germany.
kurz angerissen und ich sage auch
There's something Mr. Graeber said earlier
Entlastungspaket. 7
about the relief package.
Milliarden der
Now, 70% of the 10
gehen an
billion
10% obere Einkommen.
connected to the coal progression go to the
Paket.
utmost 30%.
Wir können noch darüber reden, ob es groß genug ist, aber die Frage ist,
I mean, one thing is we can discuss whether the package is big enough, but the other question is it fair enough?
Eingehen direkt. Das ist ja eigentlich nicht wirklich, also ja genau.
If I may make a comment,
Wirkliche Entlastung.
ich kann ja was sagen.
this isn't really
es sind
relief, right?
70% sind 7 Milliarden, die
But it means 7 billion
stehen, um damit was
Nein,
anderes zu
that won't be available for other purposes.
Vom Entlastungspaket sein.
Well, if you ask me, I didn't want the coal progression topic in the relief package.
Weil wir dazu gesetzlich verpflichtet sind, die Kalto-Progression jährlich immer wieder anzupassen.
It's a legal requirement to adjust the coal progression rate each year.
Gesetzlich dazu verpflichtet, jedes Jahr
So by law,
zu sorgen, dass die Kalto-Progression
every 2 years,
wird. Und deswegen ist es
we
eigentlich
need to fix the coal progression
dafür,
rate.
die Menschen nicht zusätzlich belasten. Und das ist auch verfassungsrechtlich so.
And we need to make sure that we don't impose a higher burden on people. But the question is whether that system is
Nee, also der andere Punkt, die Kritik, die ich gerne,
still adequate
wenn man die
in the
Kalto-Progression,
first place.
ob man eigentlich nicht mehr
Yeah, I mean, the question is, if we give up coal progression,
Geringverdiener,
wouldn't it be possible
das ist eine Kritik,
to actually give more of a relief to low earners?
die innerhalb der Koalition kämpft. Das ist, glaube ich,
This is something that my party and my parliamentary group is fighting for.
die Mehrheit.
But unfortunately, the finance minister is not from our
Die
party.
Kalto-Progression fokussieren und sagen, das
But I
ist,
think if we focus only on the coal progression
weil unabhängig von Entlastungspaket
and use that to say that we're only helping the wealthy, then this is not the point.
von dem Paket.
Ms. Uttermühlen, what do you think about the relief package?
Es gibt ein paar gute Sachen dabei und
I think there are some
sein können vielleicht,
good things. Others could have been better.
die schon gelaufen sind, vielleicht wie die Mehrwertsteuer
And there are other topics like lower VAT
oder Gasumlage, in welcher Form man
or the gas levy.
da würde ich sagen, die waren vielleicht auch eher kontraproduktiv.
That might have been counterproductive.
Finde ich, es gibt
But taking one step back,
3 Punkte, die es zu beachten gilt.
I think there are 3 things to be taken into account.
Knappheit. Wir reden viel zu wenig darüber.
First, we have a supply problem, and we don't talk about that. We only talk about relief measures,
Aber warum
and
machen wir nicht mehr?
that is understandable because the pain is very acute. But why don't we do more on the supply side by, for example, saying we need to keep all the nuclear power plants running? Why don't we use coal-fired power plants again?
Wie haben Sie eben genannt?
I mean, it's an exceptional situation.
Eine furchtbare Situation wie der vor.
And I think we can all expect that there will be a even more serious crisis in the autumn. And so why are we not discussing this? And not at some point in the future, not only as reserve energy, why didn't we start discussing this much earlier, i.e. in April?
Alle AKWs werden bereit.
If today we were to say that all nuclear power plants
beispielsweise, oder aber auch
should be starting to once again
die Kohlekraftwerke werden
produce electricity next week,
preisdämpfend auswirken. Und das
this would already dampen the price.
wäre das schon eine direkte Entlastung.
And it would help everybody immediately.
Nee,
Yeah, but I didn't ask you about nuclear power plants. You asked about the relief package. No, but what my point is,
geht es um die
we're only talking about the relief package, but the real problem is inflation.
Impfen oder eben
And inflation can also be stopped in other ways. We can also work on the supply side to bring down prices. It's just an argument that I miss.
ähm,
But now back to the measures being taken
Ja, also-
as part of the package.
teilweise wird mit der Gießkanne gearbeitet.
On the demand side, there's a bit of a scatter cash approach, like, for example, the €9 ticket and its successor.
Gewesen, ob das da
I mean, it's been a bestseller, but I don't know whether that was very well invested money.
zwischen Rentner ist 300 wert, Student ist
And then interestingly, you're also saying 300 go to pensioners, 200 to university students, and even less to kids.
im Endeffekt wird es ja auch die
The
junge
question is that fair?
irgendwann später.
After all, it will be the next generation to pay back all of these debts.
Das wäre noch ein anderer Punkt vielleicht. Ansonsten,
That's another comment I have.
wo es um die die Preisbremse geht, finde ich eigentlich
And then the price cap for electricity, I quite like that.
direkt.
It doesn't
Sinnvoll
directly interfere with the structure of that market.
gewünscht hätte, sicherlich nicht.
Because it's not ideal.
Insbesondere von FDP und CDU würde ich auch sagen, aber auch von der SPD hat das wahrscheinlich vor ein paar Monaten
And I would assume that nobody in the government would have expected that such a measure will need to be taken, and I think it's a good idea.
In diesen Begriff Gesellschaftsvertrag. Gestern, glaube ich, im Interview
We talked about the social contract, and I heard Heinz Bude yesterday saying this is not about introducing relief packages, but this is about reshaping the social contract. What we need is a solidarity contract, meaning, well, those who are well off, they don't get anything, and the others get more.
was da überhaupt finanziert ist.
And the question is where the funds come from.
Solidaritätsvertrag.
Mr. Toos, a social contract or solidarity contract, unfortunately, interpreter.
Zum Belastungspaket.
Well, as far as the relief package is concerned, this is an interesting democratic process because we haven't agreed on all the details and gas seems to be missing. Well, this is what the European Union deals with.
Die Größen hat also aufgrund dieser
Yes, but
Vorstellung davon.
it's very hard to get a proper idea how big the problem actually is. Well, due to the relief package, because we need much more and we need to think bigger.
Solidarisch.
And that's why we need to ask this question
Die Spannung
as to the solidarity contract. And then, of course, there's a lot of tensions because of cold progression.
Rechtsnorm ist.
And cold
Das Problem,
progression might be enshrined in the law,
dass riesige Kosten auf die
but what is really obvious is that society as a whole will face a lot of costs, exploding costs, and this will lead to a lot of pain within our society. And the solution that we need is a solution that has to redistribute,
der in dieser
taking it away from those who are well off and giving it to those who are worse off. So
Bremse verschreibt. Das ist nicht mein
I, well, don't proclaim myself to be in favor of the debt break, but of course we don't need a package that is financed by deficits. But we need to ask this question regarding taxes in order to find a solution.
das machen. Das hilft.
There, of course, there might be windfall taxes. This would help, and this could be a targeted measure.
Aber ich
But we need to scale this up.
der Frage ausweichen können, also wie
But we cannot turn the blind eye to the question as to how to deal with this loss of property and distribute this loss of property. And Well, I think the coalition, well, is not able to deal with it. They can deal with the energy transition, but I don't think that they will find a structural solution to that. The Tory government, well, this was very much to my surprise. They tend to be much more flexible because it's one party that is in power. They can communicate this to their voters. This might be due to the rationality of the British process. But when looking at the coalition, and this was also mentioned by Joe Stickley,
Und das macht eine Entscheidungsfindung.
well, they are all fighting for their own interests, and this, of course, is a problem and makes it even more complex. Well, I disagree for a number of reasons. Please be brief. Yes, I try to be brief because we also want to have a Q&A session later on.
Wenn wir die Transformation oder die Transformationen erfolgreich
Well, if we want to be successful with the transitions, then the question is, well, who can provide the funds? So kudos to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. This is really the right topic to talk about, if you ask me personally, or as a social democrat. We have a very clear party manifesto, but on the other hand, I need to deal with a political reality at hand. And, well, we don't have a share of 35 or 50%, but these are the three parties that were voted for, and this is not about standing out. This is really about the convictions and beliefs we have when talking to a liberal, and we trying to find out what do we need in order to promote transitions and transformations. And they say, well, the market will be the solution to all the problems, and they're really serious about it. And we as social democrats, of course, we have a different idea. And as far as the German system is concerned, because you use the British system as a comparison, yes, usually things take more time here, but our system is very resilient. Political parties, they need to cooperate, and then we have the different Länder, the federal states, and they also intervene. This means that things take longer. But on the other hand, we have a broad consensus whenever taking a decision. But the only thing you need to do is to be open about the fact that Christian Lindner knows very well that he's always trying to work around the debt brake. There is no debt brake. Well, maybe he doesn't have to admit it because he claims that there is a debt brake, but actually there isn't. It is a way. Well, you have to distinguish between loyalty and beliefs. Sometimes they are convinced that they're doing the right thing, but the other question is it really right to say that we still have a debt brake? And what do we think about a political decision maker that claims that he will see the debt brake next year, putting it into praxis? But is this really credible, or is this an illusion? And that's exactly the question that we need to ask ourselves. This is, well, opinions and ideas and beliefs. This is all very well, but this is about reality. This is not a question of belief, of values, but you need to be realistic. We understand these problems, the core of these problems, and this is why we are pursuing the policy we pursue.
Werte der anderen auf der gleichen Ebene stellen, wenn sie so wenig Bodenhaftung haben, wie die Position innerhalb der Koalition.
We cannot believe in what they say because
auch gerne, Sie machen einen neuen
This is not really reasonable what they say. What about a new coalition agreement, an honest coalition agreement?
Ich glaube, vor 3 Monaten
I think
Kevin Kühnert ein etwas
I talked to Kevin Kühnert 3 months ago, and he said this just an empty shell.
Ich sehe das nicht so. Ich finde,
No, I don't agree. I think this is really a very sound coalition agreement because we have seen a huge crisis that we are facing, and we need to find a way to solve this crisis.
wundere, dass es
Well, sometimes I'm quite surprised by the statements of our finance minister because I'm also wondering how we can stick to this idea of our debt break, but the Liberals, they are our partners. They're not our opponents. Of course, I still have the same beliefs, but we want to find a solution with our coalition partners. There's no alternative to this, and we really need to
da schon eine klare
stand up for our values, and you will realize that we account for large parts of the relief package, but of course there are some limits to that.
Welt oder die Wirtschaft sieht ja und kann auch
Well,
rechnen und sieht auch die Finanzierung für das Entlastungspaket.
banks, of course, will realize that there's no real funding to the relief package and that it will be hard to put the coalition agreement into practice, and we don't know how to pay for it.
Im Moment so, wie sie ist mit der Ampel und dem Koalition.
And do you really think the coalition agreement and the coalition itself is credible? Well, I have to admit that I have a good impression of the agreement and the coalition reflecting our society, no matter
für jeden ist etwas dabei. Das ist aber auch
the political affiliation you have. Of course, no one will be happy with all these decisions being taken, but we're in the middle of a crisis, and this may also lead to more cohesion because there's something in for everyone.
eher verankert ist. Also ich glaube, dass das eher ein gutes
I believe that this is a good political recipe dealing with such a severe crisis and facing these challenges that I've just mentioned. So
die Schuldenbremse
I think it's the right thing to do, and the debt break is part of our constitution, so you can't do anything about it. So the idea is that this is an objective that needs to be reached. So the idea is to stick to it. Well, and if there will be a recession, if there's a recession, well, of course, things are different, but the idea is to have fewer fiscal impetus next year, and this will have an impact on inflation too.
dass man quasi den Haushalten, die
So the idea is to provide more funds to lower income households,
fiskalpolitisch dann noch mal stärker
but from a fiscal policy point of view, we need to do more.
Ich würde jetzt, bevor wir das Publikum einbinden, noch
And before asking our audience,
reinwerfen. Und zwar hat
would like to ask you one more question. Isabel Schnabel at the ECB said we have great volatility, so no one actually knows what's to come. It's not only about the lack of Russian gas, no one knows whether there will be a new COVID variant, and no one knows whether supply chains in China will really hold, or maybe we have a drought next year and we won't have a shortage of wheat.
Vorbereitung eigentlich erfordert. Und die heißt,
So actually we need to prepare for that, and well, and this is not about relief package 3, 4, 5, 6 or trade unions.
sagt, Sie gehen fest von einer Rezession.
So you said there will be a recession, at least this is what you expect. What do you think do we have to face, and what can we do about it?
Was heißt,
Using relief packages or
wir
maybe not using relief packages. Mr. Toos, would you like to start?
Deshalb ist, wir kehren zum alten Problem zurück. Was wir brauchen.
So we're coming back full circle. What we need is more capacity, fiscal capacities, and sound balance sheets, and that's why we need
Gehört die Schuldenbremse.
the freedom to decide. The debt break is part of a different era, and this is the main problem. And
Auf der EU-Ebene
if this is not working at a German level, we need to take this to the European level. There we have a lot of fiscal capacities
der EU aus der Hand.
because, well,
Und
European bonds sell very well, and this is the only way to give a general answer to your question, because it is very difficult to anticipate any crises. We can't go back, and we cannot start a historic consolidation process. This would be counterproductive. What we need to do is to look for crisis control and cushion mechanisms.
mit einer
So the foreseeable risks need to be dealt with. We need to reduce these risks. So wherever we see a risk, we need to invest in long-term measures. And we need to be prepared to be
Reaktionen
flexible in our response with a lot of clout.
gesetzt werden müssen. Und in diesem strukturellen Sinne, das
And
zur UK,
as far as structural issues are concerned, this is why I mentioned the UK is
reduzierten Form
we need to act and have sovereignty when doing that. This is what the United States can do and what Japan can do.
Jahrzehnt an und das Problem wird
We need a fiscal union in the European Union, and this is an ever more pressing problem, and this is the only answer I can give. This is the capacity of a modern tax government. This is what Europe needs. Otherwise, we don't need to talk about sovereignty.
Ich mache mal weiter. Ich glaube auch, dass wir in den letzten 10 Jahren
I think in the past 10 years, well, this was a special decade. We have seen negative interest rates.
das wird sich jetzt ändern. Ich glaube,
There was a lot of support for fiscal policy, so there will be rising inflation. It cannot be backed up by the ECB. This was, however, very important for Germany and other countries too. And this means
eher, sagen wir mal, straffer geführt werden muss. Ich denke, da muss man
we need stricter fiscal policy and tend to put a greater focus on
diese zu unterstützen,
investing in transformation.
dass man keine Revolution quasi hat und muss
On the other hand, we need to, well, keep any revolutionary tendencies at bay, and we need to help people not to
viel mehr Spielraum ist. Was bedeutet das denn dann aber?
fall below the poverty line. So what does it actually mean? I think
Zum einen
there needs to be less state intervention when it comes to economics, but this applies to Germany, but it also applies to Italy. So 5% GDP will be what's at stake this year in order to fight the crisis. And since this is not a one-off event and it will take longer than this year, there will be 2 or 3% next year. Then we look at Italy. Well, there will be about 150%. And then we look at the European level. But
diese super niedrigen Renditen der EU? Oder warum werden der EU die Anleihen aus der Hand gerissen? Das
But why do European bonds sell so well? Well, this is also
nationaler Ebene,
due to German credit worthiness.
wer unterschreibt denn?
So if fiscal policy is restricted, the question is, well, who
Ich glaube, das wird kein riesiger Druck.
can account for the credit worthiness of the European Union? So I think this will be, well, this can only be some small funds. I don't think that this is the solution, the silver bullet. So it will getting even more difficult in the future. And EU funds cannot be the solution, and
Der einzige Notbehelf.
but it's the only, fallback solution, the only general answer to the question, because otherwise we won't be able to have any specific answers because we do not know what to expect. This is a kind of minimum solution in order to give a broad answer to this question. Of course, I share your pessimistic view, and this is the last point I would like to mention. We need to strengthen the private sector. However, we need to promote innovation in order to shape this green transformation at a global level.
Ich glaube, für die nächsten Jahre
I think in the next few years to come, I think we need a strong government. There will be a transformation intertwined with a number of social challenges that we have to face. There will be a lot of companies facing difficulties, and it is important that the state is in control.
absolut gerechtfertigt.
And it's the right thing to do to have debts in order to support people and businesses. And this is what our Chancellor said. He said we will do anything that's humanly possible in order to support our people. It's very similar to the whatever it takes speech given by Draghi. Yes, prices are soaring, and this is also felt by the people.
Durchkommen werden. Das
And we cannot deny this, but the fact that we be able to make it through winter time is a success, because our gas deposits were empty when the coalition came into power. And the fact that we will be able to make it through winter, this is a success story. Prices are going up, and that's why we have the relief package, but still, this is a success. And in order to answer your question, a state being in control, taking fiscal measures and introducing relief packages will be important. And I agree with Mr. Toos, even the International Monetary Fund made this suggestion that we need European bonds, that we need European debts, and there will be a lot of discussions. It's very hard to find a common denominator here, but I think this is the only way to do. We need fiscal reforms at a European level.
Wir hätten jetzt noch bei einigen Punkten in die Tiefe.
So, of course, we could have looked into greater detail, but the idea was to also take your questions. We have 2 microphones, and I would like to ask you to use a microphone. Should you have a
Der
question?
Herr dort hinten,
The gentleman in the back,
dort und
and the
dann
lady over there,
bitte zu dem Mikro.
and
Ach
the
so,
young gentleman over there.
eben gerade gehabt. Tut mir
I think I pointed to you. I'm sorry.
ein bisschen schwierig.
It's a bit hard to do.
Zwei Fragen an den SPD.
I have 2 questions to a colleague from the Social Democrats. Maybe are there more people that can expect to
Weiterhin eine
the benefit of 200 or 300 euros?
die Agenda bestimmt und nicht die Partei, die
And what can we? Why is it that the Liberals are having a say here? Because it's the Social Democrats that received most of the votes. And then I have a question to all 3 of you. The biggest crisis, of course, is climate change. And this package
alles
really has a negative impact on climate change.
Nichterhöhung der CO2-Abgabe, wie sie eigentlich geplant ist,
For example, the freeze of the CO2 levy.
rechtfertigen, dass man
So how do you justify this decision?
Ein bisschen sammeln.
So maybe we collect questions first.
Die Dame bitte.
The lady over there.
Ich bedanke mich bei der Friedrich-Ebert.
I would like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this event, and I would also like to thank Mr. Toos
Steigerungs
for his great presentation
in den 70er entwickelt worden sind.
explaining
im Fach Wirtschaftslehre und
the improvement that was made in economics since the 1970s, because in the 1970s I had to deal
gegeneinander führen kann, wie das damals der Fall war.
with the relation of business and studies and economics, and
Heute imponierenderweise entwickelt worden sind. Meine Frage,
my question is,
Sie haben immer nur argumentiert von der Makroebene aus.
you used macroeconomics
Gleichzeitig haben
as an argument, which is the right thing to do when talking about this topic. On the other hand, you also looked into the microeconomic level, but this has never been done before in economic history, because usually low-income households, they just had to deal with macroeconomic decisions, and at times where the Social Democrats had to fight during emperor's times,
führte, dass die Einkommenslage
there were just
Stiftung und der SPD keine Chancen hatten.
soldiers were just deployed in order to solve the situation. But nowadays, it's still a microeconomic situation. So, and due to our educational systems, our citizens do not have the necessary skills to deal with this crisis. So my question is, the measures that you have been developing at a macroeconomic level, how can they be successful, considering regarding households that do not have the skills to be successful in the market, either as an employee or a private household? Thank you.
Mein Name ist Hans-Georg Tillmann, ich bin Rechtsanwalt und
My name is Hans-Georg Tillmann, and I've been a member of the Social Democrats since 1972.
Inflation ist eine politische Inflation.
This inflation is a political inflation, and we need two things. First of all, we need peace in Ukraine, so we cannot leave it to Putin and Zelensky. We need more people intervening. And the second thing is we need to normalize our relationship with Russia. Maybe some people are now upset, but I would like to remind you that we find ourselves in a situation where humanity needs to make a deal with the devil, because climate change is very severe and we cannot afford to lose time or money in order for the war dragging on. So we need global cooperation instead of confrontation to save humanity.
Die Antworten. Ich habe mir notiert bei dem ersten im Prinzip, aber Herr Thus hat schon.
Okay, now over to you, Mr. Toos.
Auf die provokante letzte Frage sofort zum Anfang.
Perhaps I start with the last question.
Schön wäre es, wenn man
Yeah, of course, it would be great.
zu einem ertragbaren
It
Ergebnis.
would be great to believe that such a strategy would lead to a sustainable result. I mean, your proposal is logical,
Aller anderen vernünftigen
and it's also the position of the German government and other European governments. We need a negotiated peace.
zwei Parteien zu
The
haben,
problem is
mit sehr ungleicher
that we're dealing with two
sich vermutlich auf keinen
countries and very asymmetrical power relations. And I don't think Russia will accept a solution
abhängig, das heißt in
that
gewisser
is beneficial to Ukraine if he's not forced. And Ukraine basically depends on us and depends on Ukraine. So we can force them to negotiate a peace, but the question is whether that's what we want. At the moment, we don't.
betroffen. Stattdessen
And that's why we've decided to deal with this problem in a different way. That is our challenge.
einen gangbaren Weg
If there were to be a feasible way to an acceptable kind of peace that would restore Ukraine's rights, then I think we'd all be in favor.
und das wäre die
That would be the perfect solution.
ist, dass das nicht möglich ist. Und das ist ein
But
strukturelles Problem für die Europäische
this is structurally not possible. It is a very profound challenge for Europe.
auseinandergehen. In dem
And also, we have to take into account that European and American interests might diverge here. Europe is very much interested, and the US perhaps doesn't even care or doesn't have to care. It's a more strategic question for them that also relates to China. And it's not that I'm judging us, but it is a problem for the Western Alliance. I quite liked the question concerning the management of households. That has always been an important topic, and different reforms have been tried.
Man sollte sie alle gleichzeitig verfolgen, aber nicht.
And I think they should still be pursued, although one can't replace the other. To be more concrete, as you said, it is true that individuals, households don't always have the capacity to manage themselves. They don't always have the understanding. And it should be in everybody's interest to help them. The question is, how can that be forged into a strategy? I would argue that this is a task for the state. The state needs to provide for regulation and protect the citizens. And individual education is one option, but there are limits to it. And then on the question concerning climate policy. Yes, it is true that supporting fossil fuels is not in the interest of climate protection. It's a step into the wrong direction. But again, I don't think we should judge this. It's just tragic. It's a tragic situation that we're stuck in. And the question is, how can we get out of this at the lowest possible costs? Yes, the new policy approach takes away some of the incentives, but I don't think anybody will come out of this crisis thinking that a system based on fossil fuel is the best system. I mean, for some people, it might seem that gas and oil are so essential. But I think people will understand that this is nothing that we can base our future on. I mean, at the moment, the concern is that nobody will freeze in the winter. But in the long term, I think it's very clear that working against climate change remains urgent. And then about this question, I think this question about climate change was also about the relief package, that the relief package doesn't really include anything that would help the environment. You know, I don't really agree. The relief package, as I said before, is to provide targeted assistance. And if we look at the legislation we passed in the German Parliament, you will see that the energy transition is still something that we promote, and also at great speed. So I don't really think there's a contradiction or that we've lost our course. You mentioned the CO2 price, and yes, that has very much been a topic of debate also within our party, but we've come to the conclusion that at this very moment where energy has become so incredibly expensive, we don't want to cause this to exacerbate the crisis. And then I'm not sure I really got your comment about the financial allowances and whether they really help people. Sorry, the gentleman speaks off mic and the interpreters can't hear him.
Wenn man rechnet, dass einfach mehr des Geldes, das entlastet wird, an die Oberen gehen, die es eigentlich gar nicht brauchen.
I said, in fact, there is a bottom-up redistribution. And if you hand just 100 or 200 to some people at the lower end, that's not going to change their lives.
Der Abbau der kalte Progression noch mit reinnehmen, wenn Sie das rechnen würden, dann gibt es tatsächlich auch
if we don't include coal progression here,
Geringverdiener und Geringverdienerinnen gezielt sind, wir reden viel zu wenig über die Wohngeldreform.
then
Wir sorgen
we have to say that there's been a lot of support for
vor der Situation kommt, dass sie aus ihrer Wohnung raus.
low-income earners. Let's take the example of the housing allowance or the heating allowance. That was a part of the second relief package.
Vielleicht nicht genug präzise war beim Entlasten.
And perhaps that second package wasn't targeted enough. But as for the third package, I think the Social Democrats really left a mark here.
Das finde ich ein bisschen unglücklich, muss ich jetzt mal sagen.
Now let me comment on the CO2 price. I also think
Wenn man daran festhält, hätte man das beibehalten sollen und dann lieber.
that the old approach should have been kept.
Aber gleichzeitig würde ich auch sagen, dass an den
But at the same time,
oder langfristigen Transformationsplänen
the medium-term and long-term
diese nicht geändert.
transformation plans or the energy transition plans
Gesagt, dass der
have not been changed or negatively impacted by this crisis.
Es wird vor allen Dingen oben entlastet.
And somebody said we are mainly supporting top earners.
Im Einkommenbereich sich auf.
I mean, we have a lot of households that are somewhere in the middle and who now spend a larger share of their income on energy prices.
Dann aktivieren irgendwann sollten
And once there's going to be the electricity cap,
Entlastung bringen als den
that will also be a relief to the middle-income households.
größeres Haus mehr Energie verwenden, weil
And let's face it, people who earn more money normally have larger houses, and they also pay more for electricity.
ab einer bestimmten Grenze wird es dann super teuer. So, also das möchte ich auch nochmal sagen.
So for them, this will become really expensive.
Aber bei
Now, people keep saying that most of the benefits serve the wealthiest people,
Einkommen.
but I would beg to disagree. There really is a big relief for the lower income groups. Thank
Den
you. I think there was another question.
dritte Meldung gibt.
That young man over there, and then
Die Dame da hinten, genau. Sorry, ich muss so ein
the
bisschen
other two gentlemen, one lady.
frei und ich habe eine weitere. Der Kollege.
Ja, vielen Dank. Kurze Frage. Sie sprechen die ganze
Thank you.
Zeit, dass die Inflation eigentlich von der Angebotsseite getrieben wird.
You were saying that inflation is driven by higher energy prices,
Die Industrialisierung abzuwenden,
and you said that we need to avoid deindustrialization.
die Inflation gehemmt, weil eben die Kredite
But doesn't the ECB's decision hamper private investment?
Wir sammeln noch ein bisschen. Der Herr, Herr
Thank you. Next question.
Ich bin emeritierter Wirtschaftsprofessor von der FU.
My name is Holt Frerich. I used to be a professor here for economics, and I've always been an opponent of the debt brake.
Bremse eingehalten.
But if Mr. Lindner said that we're going to comply with the debt brake next week, then there are some other clauses to be taken into account. If we expect there's going to be inflation, we'll be allowed to take on more debts.
Diese Bemerkung gerade, dass das Problem der
And coming back to what you just said about energy prices,
Energiepreise, die kaum eine Rolle gespielt haben heute Abend,
and we didn't even talk about food prices today.
19 ausgelöst worden ist.
Much of that crisis was also triggered by COVID
kurz zu machen,
on the supply side.
nicht zu lange überziehen wollen, weil auch
Could you please keep your comment brief so that we can all finish in time?
Auf der Angebotsseite muss sehr viel mehr getan werden.
So much more needs to be done on the supply side in Germany.
Es gibt genug
Let's just mention fracking. There's plenty of gas in Germany.
weiterlaufen lassen und so weiter, bis
And then let the nuclear power plants in operation
ist. Und das
as soon as we're able to come up with other solutions.
in der
And
Ukraine
then there's the war.
so schnell
The war in Ukraine
zwar nicht
needs to come to an end as fast as possible, not based on negotiations,
Waffen
but by enabling Ukraine with the help of weapons from the West to win this war.
die Kollegin und vielleicht machen wir es auch so. Ich hatte hier noch eine vierte Frage. Dann, das sind bestimmt zwei ganz kurze Fragen.
Thank you.
Hier noch mal eine.
We can have two more questions, and please be brief, and then we take it back to the panel.
Ist nicht ganz so lang, ich fasse mich kurz.
I will keep it brief. Ines Versbing, I'm the head of the Social Policy Department at the VDK. That we are basically the pensioners lobby organization. And I receive a lot of letters every day from pensioners.
So,
So I'm very much aware of their problems. And I'm a big fan of the relief package. It was a mistake of not considering the pensioners with the second package. And so the third package is an improvement. Now, this has been a relief package, and it's going to take us through the winter. But what's going to happen after that? What are the ideas that we have, apart from taking on more debts or taking on European debts? How do we really solve that question of a social contract? Yes, the housing allowance reform is important, but we can't just hand out this allowance to 7 million households in Germany. So what are potential other ideas that could be applied later? Thank you. The last question.
Ferdinand Ley, britische Botschaft in Berlin.
Thank you. I work at the British Embassy here in Berlin. You talked about the different drivers of inflation, energy prices, labor market development, low interest rates.
Sehen Sie die Inflation?
What this boils down to, let me ask you.
Wirklich weiter allen Ländern eher als
Do you think the increasing inflation is a symptom of a structural development, or is it, let's say, an immediate symptom of the war in Ukraine?
Wir starten mit Herrn Thus. Sie können dann die erste Frage mit dem Angebotsproblem, die würde ich auch...
Let's start with Mr. Thus. Perhaps you can comment on the first question. Yes, the supply-demand question is indeed critical. The interest rate increase makes it more expensive to borrow money. But the question is the chronology. Yes, it might hamper new investment. But then on the supply side, we're talking about 2 or 3 years, so it doesn't have relevance right now. The macroeconomic response will be that we want to reduce the demand to cool down the market. I think this last question is very important and also very fundamental. The short answer is the destabilization of global commodity markets, food markets, and also energy markets. All of this did not begin with the war, but it was in full swing as early as last year. And it was a mix of supply shocks, supply chain problems emanating from the COVID crisis, and that should not be underestimated. In the history of humankind, in our economic history, we've never seen a shock like 2020. A collapse of GDP globally of 20% within only a few weeks. That was unprecedented. And it led to major disruptions and also to a very unbalanced recovery of the demand, especially in the spring of last year and especially in Asia. And it was the very fast recovery of China that first destabilized the LNG market. We still haven't recovered from that, and the price spikes we've seen in the summer are now higher than last year in autumn, when the Italians already started stabilizing. So it's a real problem. It's long-term in nature. And one solution is the stabilization of the LNG market as we know it from oil. Now, the problem is there isn't actually a global gas market. We have the US domestic market, the Eurasian market, including the Russian pipelines, and then a part of LNG that's dominated by East Asia. And in order to avoid the spikes that we currently have, we need to integrate these markets. That will lead to increased prices in the US when there are sufficient LNG terminals in Mexico, but it will help Europe and Asia. But you could also say that this should not be done because this is bad for climate protection. But that's a European internal perspective. The real question is Pakistan, Bangladesh, and others, how will they get hold of gas in the next 30 years when they're in competition with China, Korea, and others?
Und diese Investitionen sind für eine Stabilisierung dieses Marktes längerfristig sehr wichtig.
But this investment is very important to stabilize this market. It doesn't affect us. We need to pursue our own goal of decarbonizing. But this is not practical in emerging or developing countries. They need that integrated gas market to stabilize because they are the ones that suffer most.
Die Rezession kommt, brauchen wir über eine Schuldenbremse gar nicht mehr nachzudenken.
And then somebody said when there's a recession, we don't need to worry about the debt break.
Politischen Impuls eben zurückzufahren im nächsten Jahr und man setzt sich vielleicht die Schuldenbremse als Ziel, aber es kann ja viel passieren.
I mean, the debt break is a goal that we have, but there will be a lot of changes, and when there's a recession, it will probably become obsolete.
Unterstützung sehen wie bei Covid, glaube ich zum Beispiel.
But the question is, will we see as much fiscal support next year as we had with COVID? I assume that the government will be more careful, but perhaps you can tell us more. Yes, and this also goes back to the question, what comes next? What are the new ideas? Well, the fact is, I don't think there is an economist in the world who would say that he or she knows what's going to happen. And so it's very hard to say what we will do next. This is a crisis that
Auch aus meinem Studium erinnere ich mich nicht dran, dass wir
I personally
Krise erlebt haben. Und deswegen
have never experienced.
Die immer kurz kommt, die immer punktuell.
And yes, and we can criticize the relief packages because they're short term.
Dass wir einen starken Staat haben, der ein
But I continue to believe that it will be important to have a strong state that takes supportive action.
Brauchen wir nicht.
And yes, of course, you're right that we don't need the debt break or this debt ceiling. Crisis or not, I don't think it is a very helpful instrument. And even with the debt break, we still have discretion.
Auch die Möglichkeit, eine Notlage, eine Notsituation auszurufen.
We can, for example, declare a national emergency, as it happened during the COVID crisis.
Die wir erleben, so eine Notsituation.
And I think now with all the multiple crises we're facing, we are already in an emergency and should suspend the debt break. But not all politicians agree with me.
Für Tricks noch.
Let's see what tricks our finance minister will come up with.
Vielleicht noch zu Ihrer Frage zur Angebotsausweitung.
Yes, and concerning your question on increasing
alle Hebel in Bewegung gesetzt werden. Ich glaube,
the supply,
und ich sage es nochmal,
I think we should do whatever we can.
Gasspeicher, der noch ganz gut gefüllt ist. Vor allem,
As somebody said before, we still have gas in our storage this winter, but next year this situation will become more dire, and then we need every megawatt that we can get, and we shouldn't rule out any options.
Das ist doch ein sehr schönes Schlusswort. Keine Denkverbote zulassen. Ich habe mir so ein bisschen was notiert.
This is a very nice closing remark. So I made some notes. It will get more difficult in the future. We need to act in a sovereign way at a German and European level. We don't need revolution, but structural changes, strong states, a strong economy. Well, these are all the buzzwords that we have heard, and if one into detail, this would be getting even more complex. I would like to thank you for joining us today, and I would like to thank our audience today. So on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, I can invite you to have a little snack with us. So some of the guests will stay and you can continue your discussions. Thank you very much for coming and have a great evening.